the progress of secession. So now some states, because of Lincoln's election, have already exited the Union, December of 1860. Now, they do so because of feeling that they don't have the power in the Union, and that mainly the focal point is that they feel like they won't have the power to be able to protect slavery from the reach of the federal government. Now, there were lots of federal government policies put in place to protect slavery. Fugitive slave clause in the Constitution, fugitive slave laws of 1850, the Dred Scott case that said slave property is not only legitimate in slave states, but could be moved into free states and still maintained as property there, which basically was the Supreme Court saying that states that had declared slavery illegal could still have to deal with slaves being brought into free states. The Corwin Amendment, which almost became the 13th Amendment, was a promise of the federal government never to intervene with the domestic institutions of any state. And so there are these different things that were happening during this time that were guarantees from the federal government that it was not going to touch slavery. However, a lot of the northern free states were ignoring a lot of this stuff. They were saying, no, this is the US government doing stuff that is overreach, that is unconstitutional, that is unjust, and therefore we will not follow it. And that made the southern states see this and say, well, wait a second. We make all these federal laws and then you nullify them. You don't follow them. And this is why there's a power struggle between the two sections of the Union, the North and the South, for trying to control each other through Washington, D.C., through the U.S. federal government, but trying also, in doing that process, trying not to be controlled. So that's kind of the goal, and this is what you see with individuals, and this is what you see with institutions, and this is what you see with groups and countries and governments and sections of the country, is that people have a desire to control others, yet at the same time, they have a desire not to be controlled by others. And that creates a situation of conflict. So secession starts happening. Now, secession may sound like kind of an odd or a crazy thing that has only happened one time. However, secession actually had and has a fairly long history behind it, even into the present day, where there are still some relatively successful secession movements and talk of secession, which is the splitting up or the separation politically of different groups. Now, it has kind of a negative association with it in the United States, because in the United States, the most famous example is the Civil War, in which secession was part of the goal was to protect slavery, obviously. So secession is often associated with racism, with slavery, with those type of bad things, unjust things. However, secession has a little bit more of a broad and or a broader and wider history than that. In fact, some of the most radical people against slavery, as we're going to see and be reminded of, the abolitionists during this time, which were 1% of the anti-slavery movement, and they were seen as the crazy ones. They were the radicals. They were against slavery of any kind and all this stuff, but they even advocated secession in order to break up the Union so that slavery would no longer be protected by the federal government. Secession has a fairly long and more complex history as well. As I pointed out, there's the Declaration of Independence, which declaring independence is really that core idea of secession, where the colonies declared themselves to be states, even though they were planted there by Britain. They were there for about 100 years or more, and they declare themselves to be independent states, or if we think about it this way, they declare themselves to be 13 countries. And they are no longer belonging to Great Britain, but are independent. They belong to themselves, government of the state. Okay. Now, this is an example of secession, and it also gets even more complicated when you get into the Civil War, because you have this kind of famous starting point of the American states started with an act of secession written by Thomas Jefferson, celebrated on the 4th of July every year. And so the Civil War became a lot more complex, because the Civil War is fought to stop secession, but arguably the American states were founded on the very core principle of secession, and not written by somebody who was a crazy radical. Well, not in that sense, but written by Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence, who was the governor of Virginia, who was the 3rd president of the United States. And so it was difficult to have a definitive answer about whether secession was legal or not, because it has this tradition with it. In addition to that, as we're going to see, if we remember back, that there was not just the one Declaration of Independence. There were 13 declarations of independence, technically, because all the states had to declare independence. Now, we think of July 4th, 1776. However, Virginia declared independence on June 29th, 1776. Virginia declared independence before the famous Declaration of Independence, because it was only Virginia's decision, and all the other states for themselves as well, whether or not they would decide to declare their own independence. Now, Thomas Jefferson wrote that document just as a kind of statement for all of them, a statement for the English to read, a statement for the future, and other things. But it was not an official, legally binding document. The states were the ones that had to make the decision. So Virginia declared independence from Britain before the actual Declaration of Independence, which now we've got a problem. Well, I'll come back to that in a second. Then Virginia is part of the American Revolution, fights to maintain its independence because the British didn't agree that you could just separate from them. And so Virginia fights in the American Revolution. The American Revolution comes to an end, and the American states defend their independence. Now they are 13 countries. They join together in a union under the Articles of Confederation, and then they decide not to do that anymore, and then they join under the Constitution. Now, it was up to each state to decide whether or not it would join on a team with other states under the Constitution. Now, Virginia, when it decided to join, said that, yes, we will join on this team. We will join under the contract of the Constitution in this joint confederacy or a government of different states on the same team. We agree in what the Constitution says, that our union will create a new federal government. Okay, and the federal government will be allowed to do what is in the Constitution. Everything else stays with us, the states. Now, Virginia said when it joined, listen to its statement, said, "We, the delegates, do in the name and in behalf of the people of Virginia declare and make known the powers granted under the Constitution, being derived from the people of the United States, may be resumed by them whensoever the same shall be perverted." So here's the complicated case with Virginia, which is one of the states that secedes in the Civil War. Virginia was a British colony established by the British government all the way back 1607 when they established Jamestown as the first permanent British colony in Virginia. Okay. Virginia, British colony, it declares itself to be a sovereign state. It declares itself to be in its own country, no longer under the British government. It declares independence on June 29th, 1776. The Declaration of Independence is written and sort of officially published July 4th, 1776. Virginia joins with the other states in fighting the war for American independence. Then it joins temporarily with the other states under the Articles of Confederation. Then it abandons the Articles of Confederation and joins with the other states in 1788 with the new Constitution and the new government it creates. But when it joins, now it did all this stuff independently, and when it joins the federal government in 1788, it makes an exception clause in its contract for itself. Basically, they say, yes, we agree to join under these terms and conditions. However, if the US government decides to start doing things that are unconstitutional, not what we agreed to, unjust, and we don't feel like Virginia's interest is going to be involved in staying in the Union, then we will leave. We will take back our status as a sovereign country, and Virginia can just continue to exercise its right to do that. Now remember, 1788 is not that far away from 1860, okay, or in 1861. So the question now is, if Virginia could declare independence, and that's kind of the foundation of the American states, if Virginia can declare independence from Great Britain in 1776, can Virginia 80 years later declare independence from the US in 1861? That's where it gets complicated, because Virginia was one of the original 13 that declared independence and therefore could arguably have the right to enter and exit the United States if it chose, right? So it depends on your legal theory of what you think the Constitution is, because the Constitution doesn't talk about this issue of secession. However, it comes up several times throughout American history, and the nature of the Constitution is such that states choose to join. And these 13 states existed before the Constitution, and they existed before the federal government that the Constitution creates. So now the question is, if states can choose to join, can they choose to unjoin? That's the legal question. The practical question is, well, what is that going to mean? And a war is fought to stop that from becoming a reality. Now, it wasn't just Southern states. New York said this too. They gave a conditional ratification. He said the powers of government may be resumed by the people whensoever it shall become necessary to their happiness. No, it wasn't just Southerners, and it wasn't just, we'll add some complexity here. It wasn't just Southerners, and it wasn't just states, and it wasn't just racists and defenders of slavery. The abolitionists, the strongest anti-slavery group during that time, believed in the idea of secession in order to break up the United States. Therefore, the slaves in the slave states would escape even more into the free states, and there wouldn't be the US government and the Constitution telling them that you're not allowed to do that, and telling free states that you have to send slaves back. Okay, so this guy, William Lloyd Garrison, kind of one of the founders of the abolitionist movement, in his newspaper, The Liberator, said at one time, resolved that and this is from the Anti-Slavery Society, resolved that the abolitionists of this country should make it one make it one of the primary objects of this agitation to dissolve the American Union, meaning break up the United States not into just one country, but several countries based on the states. Many abolitionists believe that the South should be allowed to secede. So they say, look, the South wants to exit, let them go. A lot of people would have said, well, why would we fight a war to end chattel slavery, but in doing so, replace it with political slavery? If you're going to fight a war that says, okay, individual people should be free and not held in slavery, it didn't seem to be consistent that you could get to that goal by forcing people who wanted to leave to remain. That's kind of the argument that a lot of the abolitionists used as well. This guy, Horace Greeley, New York Tribune in 1861, he's a Northern abolitionist. He has no sympathy for slaveholders, wants slavery to come to an end, but he believed that the Southern states had a right to secede based on the principles of the Declaration of Independence. So he's like, look, I don't agree with it, but I believe they have a right to do it. He said, we have repeatedly said that the great principle embodied by Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence, the governments derive their powers from the consent of the governed, is sound and just. And that if the slave states, the cotton states, or the Gulf states choose to form an independent nation, they have a clear moral right to do so. Whenever it shall be clear that a great body of Southern people have become conclusively alienated from the Union and anxious to escape from it, we will do our best to forward their views. So he says, look, he's very much against slavery and he's in no sympathy with slaveholders, but he does say, according to the principle of the Declaration that we believe to be just and right, his opinion is that it would be the right thing to do to peacefully let seceding states go. Now, South Carolina, a lot of times it's said, what was, the cause of the Civil War? And, the main cause is slavery, but not for the reason most people think. It's the focal point. But the Civil War is not a crusade to end, slavery in the way that most people kind of imagine it to be. But the other side of that is sometimes it's said that, the Civil War is an issue of states' rights. And that's somewhat true in the sense that, is it a state's right to enter and exit the Union? That's an important legal and theoretical question. Maybe not necessarily a question that has to involve a war, but it is an important legal question. But the Civil War and leading up to it is a crisis of states' rights in many ways, not just in the South. Okay, so the South argues for the right of being left alone by the federal government, not having the federal government get involved because they're afraid that the federal government will get involved with slavery and other things. Okay, but slavery becomes kind of that focal point. Now, the northern states are concerned about their states' rights as well. So remember, in the Constitution, there is the 10th Amendment that basically states that whatever is not written for the U.S. government to do in the Constitution, those powers remain to the states. So it's really up to the states to decide on everything else that is not clearly expressly stated in the Constitution. Okay? So the southern states say, okay, well, the U.S. government and the northerners who are trying to gain power in the U.S. government are going to try to interfere with slavery and our institutions in the South. Therefore, we should exit. Okay, that's an issue of secession, issue of the right of a state, in theory, whether or not it has the right to exit the Union legally. Now, in the North, the federal government over the years had been trying to keep the Union together, so by trying to offer compromise onto both sides. And some of the laws that the U.S. government wrote required that northern free states become a lot more active in trying to catch and return slaves. Now, slavery is illegal in their states, but they're having to catch and return slaves. Well, a lot of northern states said that's not in the Constitution. It may have the fugitive slave clause in there originally, but you can't tell us how to enforce this. Therefore, we're not going to enforce it. We're not going to help catch and return slaves that escape into this state. And we're going to arrest anybody who does that. Okay? Now that is called nullification. They said, according to the 10th Amendment, all the rest of the powers not stated in the Constitution remain with us. And for the US government to tell us to do this is a stepping on our rights. And so they passed things called like personal liberty laws and things of that nature, where if people were morally against the idea of helping slave catchers to catch slaves, arrest them, and return them, they passed these laws that said people did not have to do that. Now, in doing that, they're technically going against what the US government is telling them to do. They're breaking the law of the US government, but they're following the law of their state. Now, this is called nullification, okay? So there's nullification and there's secession. And so when it's said that the Civil War involves the issue of states' rights, it's not just in the South, and it's not just states' rights are claimed and thrown out there as just a cover for slavery, which it often can be and is, but there were states' rights issues in northern free states as well. And so the whole Civil War does have to deal with the issue of what is the role of the federal government and what is the role of the states. Now, South Carolina, when it exited, why did it say that it was leaving? Why did it say that its reason was for exiting the Union? Okay, South Carolina exits the Union in December of 1860. Well, one of the main causes they said they were leaving was because the northern states were nullifying the laws of the federal government that had to do with slavery. Which meant if they could do that, then slavery was in risk whether they stayed in the Union or whether they left. And so South Carolina decided to exit. Said the states of Maine, this is in their document with Declaration of Secession. Why did they secede? Okay. The states of Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New York, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Iowa, okay, northern and middle states, have enacted laws which either nullify the acts of Congress or render useless any attempt to execute them. Okay, so it was the exercising of states' rights by free states that actually was one of the reasons why South Carolina claimed to exit the Union. So kind of interesting here. Now let's look at Lincoln's first inaugural address. Was Lincoln, after he got elected, states exited? Okay, and this is his address in March. The war is going to really start in April. So we're very close. This is after he gets sworn in and becomes president and makes a speech. Now, what does he say in his speech regarding slavery? What does he say about the threat of civil war? What does he say would be the reason for fighting a war or not fighting a war? What people may be surprised is in his first inaugural address, he states very clearly he does not intend to try to end slavery and definitely does not want to fight a war to do that. But he is willing to use military force for something else that will involve a war. So while it's appropriate to say the main reason why the seceding states left was because of slavery, it's not an equal opposite symmetric thing on the other side to say that why the US government decided to fight the war was to end slavery. They're asymmetric goals. What does Lincoln say about slavery? Well, he says, I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. He said, look, I'm not going to interfere with slavery where it currently exists in the states. He says, I don't think it's legal, and I don't want to do it. Okay? But he does make a threat about what he will use military force to make happen. And that is to collect taxes from the states that have exited. It says, there needs to be no bloodshed or violence, and there shall be none unless it be forced upon the national authority. The power confided in me will be used to hold, occupy, and possess the property and places belonging to the government. So any land that belongs to the federal government in the states, he says that is still going to continue to be ours. And he says, and to collect duties and imposts, which at the time were their taxes called tariffs. He says, but beyond what may be necessary for these objects, there will be no invasion, no using of force against or among the people anywhere. So he says, look, there will be an invasion or a use of force to collect taxes, but not to try to end slavery. Now, there's debate on how much this affected things during the time, but how the American government, the US government, got most of its tax money, tax revenue, was through a type of taxes called tariffs, which were more of like a sales tax. Okay, they didn't have an income tax until 1913. Okay, so there's no 16th Amendment, there's no federal income tax where the government takes out of your paycheck. Okay, people kept their income, but they did pay taxes through tariffs. Now, tariffs are like a sales tax built into a product that has certain items that have these taxes on it. Now, these items had taxes on them when they came from overseas. Foreign countries would sell in products. What would often happen, though, is businesses in America would sell a product and businesses outside America would try to sell a product inside America. And often businesses outside America would sell the product for a lot cheaper, which meant that a lot of people would buy it. But businesses inside America didn't like that. They didn't like the competition. So they would go to the government and ask them to raise taxes on the stuff coming from outside America, the products. Often the US government would do that, and that's what Abraham Lincoln's Republican Party and the Whig Party before him were all about, these what were called protectionist tariffs. Now, what the protectionist tariffs would do was they would raise the prices through a tax to make something more expensive. Now, if the foreign product, because of tariffs, and the American product were now the same price, people would be much more likely to buy the American product. Now, this had and has consequences. It makes things more expensive. It makes other countries retaliate because they have their business into the United States is cut down, and it protects American business at the expense of competition, which means that it's propping them up artificially. Okay. Now, where did tariffs get collected? They often got collected at seaports, where people would come in on boats with new products to sell into the country, and they had to pay a tax as soon as they entered the port or the harbor. The thing with that was that in paying those taxes, it got more expensive to do that. Now, a lot of the taxes were paid in the South because tariffs weighed more heavily on farmers because farmers had to grow stuff, export it, sell it into other countries, and then had to buy, other clothing. So imagine if you were in the South and you were involved in farming in the cotton economy, and you work to produce this cotton. And remember, not all the farmers in the South have slave labor, so that's just part of what's going on. But then you sell the cotton to another country. The cotton comes back into the country, but it's more expensive because of the tax. And then when you're sold a shirt that has cotton in it, you have to pay a lot more. So they were feeling like the tax weighed a lot heavier on the Southern farmers than it did on people in the North who had more industry and factories and stuff like that. In addition, a lot of the main ports of business were in the North as well. New York Harbor and other places on the seacoast, big famous cities, Boston and stuff like that. So this brought in a lot of business for them. And then also they felt like in the South that the Republican Party and the businesses and big companies and stuff like that would go talk to the government and get tax money and subsidies to be spent on their big projects like railroads and other building projects. They felt like more of the money was taken from them in the taxes, and then they felt like more of the tax money was spent in the North to build roads, bridges, canals, and other things that were more common in that region of the country. So this becomes an issue as well. But if the Southern states secede and they're no longer under the Constitution, they could potentially, this is why one of the reasons why the North was willing to fight the war against the South, not just about slavery, or not even primarily about slavery in many cases, but if the South opened up certain ports, Charleston and New Orleans and some other ones, those ports, and then they charged lower taxes or caused a free trade zone, that would bring down all the business and shipping and industry from the more expensive ports in the North and transfer them to the South. And that's why a lot of the Northerners who were involved in these businesses in the North, that if the South did that and undercut them, it would take away business from them. And that's why a lot of them were willing to go to war. So Lincoln promised to defend slavery. Lincoln denied the right of secession in this speech. He says that he doesn't believe that secession is a right, but he does allude to support for the Corwin Amendment. He says there's an amendment that would make it impossible for the federal government to ever touch slavery, and he said he is in favor of that. During that time, we know that that's the Corwin Amendment. But he said he promised to use force to collect taxes and tariffs, which he calls them duties and imposts. Now, during this time, 1857, just a few years before, the highest tariff in history was created, called the moral tariff, which, imagine if you're used to paying like a 10-cent sales tax, like if you go to McDonald's and you buy a Coke and it's $1, but you really have to pay $1.09, $1.10 for that 99-cent or dollar drink, right? But imagine if it ended up being like $1.50. Okay, now you're having to pay quite a bit more. Okay, and that means that you would buy less, or that you'd have less money if you continued to buy the same amount because of the tax. So this moral tariff is created, and the moral tariff is named after the person who created it, signed into law by President Buchanan, who's the president right before Lincoln, and it doubled the rates of the 1857 tariff to an average of 47%, and iron products were taxed over 50%. So these certain products went up by 47%, and then iron products and everything that iron went into became a lot more expensive because iron products were taxed at over 50%. Okay, so now if you're a farmer and you're having to buy a shovel that has iron in it, now the shovel is a lot more expensive. You're paying a lot more, not just for that shovel, but the tax that comes with it, because this big moral tariff has been passed. One of Lincoln's jobs would have been to enforce the collection of this tariff. But if the southern states exit the Union, theoretically, they have now cut down the amount of revenue or money in taxes that the US government can collect. So if the southern states leave, if theoretically half the country leaves, that's half the amount of money to be able to fund the US government through taxes. And so there's a very powerful incentive to use the powers of government, to use the military, to use force to fight a war over this issue. Now, slavery will become more intertwined with the northern reasons for going to war, but it's the southern reason for leaving. But the northern reason for fighting is not to end slavery so much as it is to make the southern states remain part of the Union. Now, here came another threat, the Confederate Constitution of the United States. After the southern states left, they formed their own confederacy, meaning team of states, and they wrote their own constitution. Now, they liked the US Constitution for the most part, but so they kept most of it, but there are a few areas where it's different. One of those areas, it says, no state shall, without the consent of Congress, lay any imposts, duties, or imports, exports, tariffs, except what may be absolutely necessary for its executing its inspection laws. So basically, they're saying there's only going to be a very minimal tax on ships that would come into the harbor, which means that it would draw down ships from other countries to park and sell their goods in the harbors of the South that would potentially be a lot cheaper. Which means that the North not only loses the tax revenue of the southern states, but it also loses the business of foreign ships that would have gone and parked in the North, but now could potentially go park in the South. So the tariffs would be kept low in the Confederate states. This would cause trade to turn from the North to the South. This would have caused potentially the Northerners to buy cheap products from the South, crippling Northern industrialists, which meant that this would have been a huge economic blow potentially to the North. And so this is why it's important to see the Confederate Constitution, not for where it's just the same as the United States Constitution, but where it's different as well.